This Sunday, churches all over the world are going to celebrate Pentecost. Pentecost, of course, is a day when the believers were gathered in Jerusalem and the Holy Spirit was poured out upon them, and these fiery tongues appeared over their heads, and they preached in these languages that they hadn't learned to people from all over the known world at the time. So most Christians are familiar with Pentecost, but a lot of Christians are not familiar with exactly why Jesus chose Pentecost for the day on which he would pour out his Holy Spirit upon his church. I mean, he's got all the days in the year, so it's just kind of a random choice that Pentecost was the day in which this happened? No, because as it turns out, when you look at the Old Testament background of Pentecost, when you look at many of the Jewish traditions about Pentecost in the first century, you see that of all the days that Jesus could have chosen to pour out his Holy Spirit, Pentecost is the perfect choice because of its Old Testament roots and its connection with things like Jubilee, its connection with Mount Sinai, its connection with Firstfruits, and a whole lot of other things. So what we're going to do is spend just a few minutes talking about the Old Testament roots of the Festival of Pentecost and its connection with the giving of the Spirit, and we're also going to touch upon some of the rabbinic understandings of Pentecost in the first century, because these help to fill out our understanding of exactly why Jesus chose this particular day to give his Holy Spirit to the church. So let's begin in the Old Testament. So Pentecost is, in the Old Testament, it's known as the Feast of Weeks, which in Hebrew is called Shavuot. So it's called weeks for this reason. So the first major festival of the Israelite liturgical calendar was Passover, which happened in the spring. And then counting the day after Passover, you count 7 weeks of weeks. So you count 49 days. And then on the day after that, you celebrate Pentecost, or you celebrate Shavuot. So that's how it gets the name weeks. It's actually 7 weeks, 49 days, and then the 50th day is when you celebrate Pentecost. So 50 days basically from Passover until Pentecost. And Pentecost itself means 50th. So the Hebrew name is Shavuot, which means weeks, and the Greek name is Pentecost, which means 50th. So at this particular festival, on the 50th day after Passover, it was in the Old Testament, it's mainly an agricultural festival. So after the day after Passover is when the first fruits of the barley harvest were offered. And then on the day of Pentecost is when the first fruits of the wheat harvest were offered. So Passover and Pentecost together basically are the beginning and the end of the grain harvest. And so on the day of Pentecost, what the Israelites would do is they would take some of the wheat, the first fruits of the wheat, and they would bring that as an offering to God at Jerusalem. So this was the celebration of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. So it's mainly an agricultural celebration, festival in the Old Testament. But by the first century, there are very, very strong hints that it was much more. There was actually not just a giving of thanks for the wheat harvest, but it was also a giving of thanks and a commemoration for the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Now we know this, for instance, from a first century BC writing called Jubilees, which links the festival of Pentecost with the giving of the law. And we also have hints of this actually a couple of different places in the Old Testament. For instance, in Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, it says that the Israelites reached the wilderness of Sinai in the 3rd month after their departure from Egypt. Now, they left in the middle of the first month, and so the 50th day, which of course is when Pentecost would later be celebrated, the 50th day would have fallen within that 3rd month. So you can already see, just temporarily, the way that the Israelites could have linked the giving of the law with the celebration of Pentecost, because they both fell within that 3rd month. The arrival at Sinai, and thus the giving of the law, and then later the celebration of Pentecost. And in 2 Chronicles 15, there is the account of a covenant renewal ceremony that took place in Jerusalem on the 3rd month, which of course is when the celebration of Pentecost would have taken place. So we have first century evidence in the book of Jubilees, and we have later explicit references in rabbinic writings that the festival of Pentecost is connected with the covenant celebration and giving of thanks for God's gift of the law at Mount Sinai. But we also have these couple of hints in the Old Testament itself in Exodus 19, verse 1, and then in 2 Chronicles chapter 15. So together we see that the Old Testament celebration of Pentecost was connected first of all, primarily as an agricultural festival, but it's also connected later on with the giving of the law. Now, that's going to be very significant in just a minute. Now, before we get to the Christian celebration of Pentecost, I want to throw one more thing in here. There's a very close connection in the Old Testament between Shavuot, or weeks, Pentecost, and the 50th year celebration known as Jubilee. Now, you've probably heard about Jubilee. Jubilee happened every 50th year, so count with me here. You have 7 weeks of years. That is, you have 49 years, and then you have, on the 50th year, the celebration of Jubilee. Now, Jubilee is when everybody who had sold themselves, all the Israelites who had sold themselves into slavery to pay for debts, were emancipated. So you have liberty, you have freedom connected with the year of Jubilee. You also have the forgiveness of all debts, the remission of all debts happening on the 50th year. So people are freed, debts are forgiven, and ancestral lands are restored as well as allowed to rest. So the land is freed, as it were, from being worked that year. So everything is freedom, everything is liberation, everything is rest connected with the Jubilee year. Now, the Jubilee year, again, happens every 50th year. When does Pentecost happen? The 50th day. When does Jubilee happen? After 7 Sabbaths of years. That is, after 7 segments of 7 years each, so 49 years. Then the 50th year is when you celebrate Jubilee. When does Pentecost happen? Well, it's the Festival of Weeks. So you have these 7 weeks, 49 days, and then on the 50th day, you have the celebration of Pentecost. So Pentecost and Jubilee are linked chronologically in the Old Testament. So just as Jubilee is connected with emancipation, with the forgiveness of debts, and with rest, so also Pentecost is celebrated in connection with these 3 as well, because God has freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. He's given them the land, and he allows this land to be the place of rest for the Israelites. So keep that in mind too, because Pentecost in the Old Testament, as well as Jubilee, so the 50th day and the 50th year, are to be understood as connected theologically. Okay, so that's the Old Testament background of Pentecost. Now let's connect that with exactly what happens on the day of Pentecost. Well, first of all, there's a connection with the Old Testament and the New Testament with this theme of waiting. So what happened with the giving of Pentecost in the Old Testament? Well, when Pentecost was actually given to the Israelites, they were still in the wilderness. They really couldn't celebrate Pentecost until they reached the Holy Land. Well, why not? Because you can't sow wheat in the wilderness and harvest it and bring it to God when you're traveling around in the wilderness for 40 years. So the Israelites had to wait until they were given the land and sowed the fields and harvested that grain before they could actually celebrate Pentecost. So even though Pentecost is given at Mount Sinai, the Israelites have to wait 40 years until they finally reach the promised land, sow their crops, and then they can celebrate Pentecost. How is that connected with the New Testament? Well, as you go from the Passover of Jesus, his crucifixion and resurrection, to the celebration of Pentecost, the 50th day, it's a period of waiting. Jesus uses this explicit language when he tells his disciples to wait in the city until they are clothed with power from on high. So just as the Israelites had to wait until they could celebrate Pentecost, so the Christians had to wait until they could celebrate that first Christian Pentecost when Christ would pour out his Spirit upon them from above. Secondly, there's a connection with the first fruits. So in the Old Testament, the wheat harvest was brought on the festival of Shavuot, or weeks, or Pentecost. So the first fruits of the wheat were given to God. Now there's a twist that happens at the Christian Pentecost, because what happens? Christ pours out the first fruits of his Spirit on his church. So it's not these Israelites who are giving the first fruits to God. Instead, God is giving his first fruits to his newly established church. In Ephesians 1, as well as in Romans 8, Paul talks about the Spirit being the first fruits. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the Old Testament, you gave the first fruits of the crop to God, which was symbolic of the whole, so a part for the whole. By giving the first fruits to God, it was an acknowledgement that the whole field belongs to God. Now, the reason that God gives us the first fruits of his Spirit is that is a down payment or an acknowledgement that the totality of who we are belongs to God. And at the end of time, when he resurrects all flesh, then that will be manifested fully. So first fruits of the crop, the Israelites gave to God in the Old Testament at Pentecost, but God gives us the first fruits of his Spirit at the New Testament celebration of Pentecost. Secondly, because there's this connection between Pentecost and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai in many Jewish traditions of the first century, we look back at what happened at Mount Sinai, and we see phenomenologically what happened at Mount Sinai is it gives us an understanding of why God poured out his Spirit the way he did at Pentecost. So what happens at Mount Sinai? Well, all sorts of kind of pyrotechnics are going on here. You got the mountain that is burning with fire, you got smoke, you got earthquakes, you have all of this really amazing theophanic elements taking place at Mount Sinai. Very impressive. What happens at Pentecost? Well, there's the sound of the rushing violent wind, and then these flames of fire appear on top of the heads of the disciples. So even though what happened at Mount Sinai, what happened at Pentecost is not quite the same visually, theophanically, still, what you have connected between these two events is that God's voice appears out of the fire. Deuteronomy chapter 4 makes this very explicit, that God's voice came from the midst of the fire. What happens at Pentecost? Well, you have the voice of God through the preaching of the disciples coming in connection with the fire that is on top of their heads. So fire and the divine voice are connected both at Sinai as well as at Pentecost. And then you have at Sinai, you have the giving of the first covenant, and at Pentecost, you have the Spirit being given by Christ as a way of establishing and perpetuating and preaching the new covenant, which was prophesied by Jeremiah. So just like the covenant of the law was given at Mount Sinai, so now the new covenant, the covenant of grace, the covenant that Jesus makes with his disciples in the upper room, that covenant is going to be preached. It's the covenant of Jesus himself, in which he has fulfilled the law for us and given to us forgiveness and salvation and liberation. And that finally takes us to this last point that I want to make, and that's a connection between the Old Testament celebration of Pentecost and Jubilee, and now Pentecost and the ultimate Jubilee. Because what happens at the New Testament celebration of Pentecost? Well, you have Christ finally giving his Spirit to his church to proclaim liberty, just like the Old Testament celebration of Jubilee was one about liberty. There's emancipation, there is forgiveness of sins, just like there was remission of debts in the Old Testament, and just like the land was allowed to rest at the celebration of Jubilee in the Old Testament, so now we are given rest in the Messiah in the celebration of Pentecost. And I'll throw one more thing in here. Keep in mind what Jesus said in his sermon at Nazareth. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the captives, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." Now, Jesus is using the language of Jubilee there, but notice what he first says. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." So Jesus connects the Spirit with Jubilee. Just so, the Spirit is now given at Pentecost, which was like a mini Jubilee in the Old Testament. And now, in the true Christian Pentecost, it is the full Jubilee. It's the full Pentecost, because now God is bringing to fruition everything that he has proclaimed in the Old Testament, everything that he's foreshadowed in various ways to the Old Testament, because he's given now this gift to his church. So we celebrate Pentecost today with an understanding of all this Old Testament background, because by understanding this Old Testament background, it allows us to fully appreciate exactly why Jesus chose, of all the days on the calendar, the day of Pentecost in which to make this happen. He gathers people from all over the world. He proclaims through his disciples the message of grace, the new covenant, and liberation, and all of the gifts that the Messiah has won for us. So that is a quick run through the Old Testament understanding of Pentecost and how it connects with the Christian celebration of Pentecost. Now I'm going to put in the comments underneath this particular video links to a couple of articles that I've written where I flesh this out much more fully, and you can find all the details there with regard to the resources for these rabbinic traditions as well as the biblical teachings about Pentecost. Thanks for watching, and may God bless your Pentecost celebration this Sunday. I appreciate it.